Welcome back to FreightWaves Now on this Monday morning. It's time to check in with Tyler Cole, co-host of our Net Zero Carbon podcast and also our Director of Supply Chain Intelligence here at FreightWaves. Tyler, thank you for joining us on this Monday.
Hey, y'all. Good morning.
Good morning, Tyler. It's always great to have you here. Get our morning started off with you in the Monday. So, Tyler, when we're jumping into some of the most recent news, we're seeing that there is a lot of kind of recent movements from the S.E.C. as they kind of move closer to enacting a sweep climate disclosure rule. Can you dive into some of that, some of the underlying trends here, and really what's going on with all the moving pieces?
Certainly, yeah, that's a big deal that was a long time coming. We've heard rumors about it for months and months and months, where the S.E.C. was considering promoting a policy that would require public firms to invest climate-related risk. And that includes everything from emissions to supply chain mapping, weather, climate risk events for either their assets or their suppliers' assets. So it's really wide-ranging, and it's behind a lot of other economies that have done this. Europe certainly is leading the charge here, but you've got other countries around the world who have similar policies in place for their firms. And S.E.C. is doing this not just because of it's a climate activist organization. They're doing this from an investment risk management perspective. They're trying to make sure that people who are investing in these companies have appropriate levels of information to determine how they're going to deploy capital. So we've seen that the climate movement over the last 18 months has really, really accelerated because we're seeing large financial institutions start to shift their weight behind a lot of these net zero targets. And this is just an ongoing domino falling here in this chain that we're watching. So when we think about how this might potentially impact freight and logistics, the biggest piece in my mind is no doubt emissions reporting. We start thinking about all these firms now have to go out and calculate and measure their own footprint from their scope 1, which would be direct activities, to their scope 2, which is their purchase power generation. And potentially, and this is the big question mark in my mind, their scope 3 emissions, which for most of our listeners or anyone who's tuned into the show would understand that your indirect freight spend is a big piece of that scope 3 footprint. So if there is now potential policy in place that's going to require large firms to report their emissions, people are going to start putting a big microscope on how big their freight footprint is. And that's the biggest takeaway for me.
So, Tyler, I'm interested in this from the scope of the VC market and really just kind of the general investment market in both freight tech and freight in general that we've seen kind of explode over the last 18 months. Our CEO, Craig Fuller, talks a lot about how freight tech is kind of the new fintech. And when we talk about freight, almost everybody, as you mentioned, has a scope 1, 2, and even 3 emissions that directly touch their companies. And so when we're talking about companies now going out to seek fundraising or looking at the path to going public, either through IPO or SPAC. Now they're going to have to do a ton more work to put a ton more information to garner kind of the interest of these investors, correct? And can you talk about if that might extend the timeline for some of these companies now either seeking fundraising or with the intent to go public?
I don't know that it'll necessarily extend the timeline. It's a big consideration for firms. It's definitely further down the list than just macro market environment, right? And how we're seeing rates rise and private capital deployment start to slowly, at least slow down from the valuations we've seen over the last few months for early stage and even growth stage. But it is a consideration. And I do think a lot of the firms won't be as concerned about this because when you talk about the big names that have seen big valuations in freight tech and climate tech, and even fintech, they're pretty minimal footprints. We're not seeing a ton of like heavy industrial applications trying to raise capital in this sector that you're specifically mentioning. So it really is more of a data question. I mean, that's why we see you see Microsoft and a lot of the Salesforce, big software heavy companies that don't have a huge physical footprint outside of, purchase power for data centers and things like that. They're not running trucks. They're not selling oil. They're not doing all these, mining activities that are going to have a big climate environmental impact. So those firms really should be the ones that have an easier path to market when you're talking about disclosures because they have less data and less hurdles to reduce their emissions overall than a lot of other companies. That's a long way to answer your question. I do think it's a consideration. It should not slow the path to funding for many companies, but it's something as you're looking out towards the end of this year, you really want to know, well, what are the standards I've got to adhere to? Because if we're talking about no longer typical like auditable financial records. Now we're going to have some sort of auditable environmental performance record. There's a whole nother, cottage industry that's going to have to pop up around helping people measure, monitor, and verify those emissions in line with whatever the standard ends up being, whether it's the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. I think that's kind of the leader in the clubhouse today. But this is probably a 2 to 3 year cycle before we start to see it play out and really be implemented and causing people, some heartache if they don't have their numbers in line.
And Tyler, can you dive into that a little bit more? Because one of the things I'm interested in is really defining the terms. And when you look at what's really being put forward is, when I look at economic data, someone tells me something is moving or growing, I'm thinking, okay, by what metrics? What type of movement or what kind of changes does this bring to metrics to kind of make sure that there's some kind of systematic approach here?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of collaboration and policy to really get those metrics in line. I'm sure you've seen a lot of the consternation around ESG index funds, right? How do we know what's in it is really good because it's sort of subjective. Can I call it ESG just because I've got, a software company in there that doesn't have a big environmental footprint? Or maybe they're buying offsets. That's a good thing. But should I also include airlines or other firms like that because they have good governance, right? They've got good gender diversity or pay representation. It's really complex. There are, probably 3 to 5 kind of top tier ESG ratings firms out there that most of these managers, fund managers, institutional money managers are looking to kind of cover their bases. Like, hey, we trusted what these guys said, right? But it is a big umbrella. It talks about everything the company does, right? Social aspects, governance, as well as environment. And it's different depending on sector. So should I be worried about comparing a software tech company with an industrial firm or a chip manufacturer? Probably not, but there's going to be some overlapping. And that's really what this call from the SEC is we need those comparable metrics. We need to be able to invest with confidence and be able to look within a specific vertical and cross-sectorally because some of them do matter. And they're not just specific to your particular business. I'll give you an example. So within freight, if you're a publicly traded fleet, right, your emissions footprint is going to be whatever you're burning on the road. Like you're not going to have a ton of optionality today. There aren't enough EVs on the world to be able to convert, the largest fleets in America to EV tomorrow. We just can't do it. So they've got to also be concerned about putting a number in place, making sure it's accurate, and hitting their other metrics around, how am I comparable with my labor pay or my board diversity? How am I doing at providing reports back to my shareholders and investors? Are we hitting our stated targets? There's not a general consensus. And so, I hate to disappoint the economist in you and say that you don't have clear numbers and metrics to go off of, but it is a rapidly evolving market that, in my mind, will take shape over the next 24 months.
Tyler, this question might feel like it's kind of coming out of left field, and this is my own curiosity asking this.
Love it.
Talking about cryptocurrency in this space, we know a lot of folks that are getting really big and heavily invested into the cryptocurrency mining space specifically. That mining takes supercomputers, which takes a ton of money, and it takes a ton of energy, a ton of property to do this as well, which then of course comes along with those scope 2 emissions from the power generation and power sourcing. Does this SEC ruling kind of target anything in that crypto space? Or is that now open for interpretation as we're seeing more of this transition to a wider acceptance of cryptocurrency?
I don't read into it that it's a specific targeting of anything in that space, but it clearly would cover the activities in that space. And if you think about it on the other side of the coin, or the Bitcoin, it might provide opportunities for, collaborative sectors. So think about somebody who's got a natural gas extraction company and they're actually flaring methane. They have a terrible footprint, but you could capture that methane and use it to power a Bitcoin server out in the field and just drop a container out there with a bunch of hardware in it, and you're solving 2 problems at the same time. Now, you're still using a bunch of energy, but you're also reducing emissions from this other party. So it gets pretty complex, and that's why these rules have to start forming the market, because if you're going to hold individual actors accountable, maybe in that scenario, the gas company just starts mining Bitcoin. And there's precedent for that happening in the market today.
And Tyler, that kind of makes me think of some of the unintended consequences or maybe benefits from some of these actions from the SEC. Are there anything that may be on your radar right now that might be an unintended consequence or maybe unintended benefit or an unintended outcome from this new ruling that could be taking place?
Yeah, the one that I see constantly mentioned is people wanting to divest as a way to reduce emissions, right? Whether that's changing your portfolio or banks no longer lending to fossil companies. And the reality is, when we don't have the transparency from well operated companies, we can't hold them accountable. So having Shell sell an oil field to a state owned oil company who's not going to be as transparent is not necessarily a good thing. So I hesitate to say people should use divestment as the preferred method of trying to green yourself. To me, that's just another form of greenwashing. If you're not taking an active stakeholder stance to engage with the firm to get them to actually change the way they're doing business, then you're opening the door for some malicious actor to try and reap the benefits of just market volatility. I mean, look at the gas situation going on over in Europe. It's a similar concept. If we don't think about the unintended consequences 10 years down the road, we're going to find ourselves in a sticky place. So I hope that people don't read into avoidance or divestiture of firms, or specifically cutting off the flow of money to polluting assets. Because think how terrible that would be if we stopped investing in freight and moving goods, because diesel is what is really running the economy. We would have all these unintended side effects similar to what we've seen for the last 2 years in this pandemic disruption, right? The second order effects of what happens when you stop moving goods.
Absolutely. You can't just cut off money and expect it's like cutting off the head of a hydra, right? You cut off one and they pop up their own on the side, exactly. So Tyler, these are just proposed regulations. They're not fully implemented yet, and they're not fully being handed down by the S.E.C. Is there a timeline that exists for these regulations, or what are the next steps to get them to that implementation process?
I've read a few analyses of it, 60-day comment period for the public. I have no doubt there will be some form of legal challenge from certain constituencies. And the likelihood of getting this approved and passed and codified and then implemented, it's a multi-year approach. So you're looking at least 2 years out. I would say 2024 is probably the earliest that you start to see mandates for compliance. And it might even be phased in, depending on the sector and how the rules end up taking shape. For those in freight and logistics, I would just say, look, if you've got a 2-year runway, we tell people all the time, if you're not measuring now, you're late. Go ahead and start thinking about this. You're going to be held accountable for what emissions are coming from your operations and your indirect spend. So go ahead and start investing. Call me. We can tell you about your freight spend here using our own calculators and help you start reducing. If we can't, then we'll certainly connect you with other suppliers and people who can help your other non-freight related emissions measurements. So it's got to be a multi-year cycle, but people have to start taking action now.
And last question before we let you go. Obviously, these rulings will be handed down from the S.E.C, a government-involved commission, but oftentimes some of those elected representatives have some of their own financial assets tied up in some of these companies who might be some of those big polluters. Do you think that this could have any type of, kind of extra impact on whether the rulings end up being passed? Obviously, it wouldn't be the most clean way of getting this passed because it's your own personal interest for those elected officials, but could that be a challenge?
Yes and no. I think there's always going to be varied interest in a lot of these negotiations. There's been other conversations going on about how transparent our elected officials need to be with their holdings and whether they can or cannot buy while they're in office and serving. That's going to continue a pace separate from this S.E.C decision around climate disclosures we're talking about specifically. And I'm not concerned about someone holding investments in firms that will be impacted, because it's an economy-wide impact. So I don't think we're trying to see, funds shifting from dirty to clean, and those who hold clean tech all of a sudden reap the benefit. The reality is, if we're not providing real economic value, none of those companies should be in business. So they're going to have to just learn to play within the boundaries of the new rules of the game. And, I don't lose sleep over those specific lobbying interests dictating policy, although, maybe that's naive and I probably should.
The lobbying interest, that was the word I was looking for, Tyler. Thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us today. Always great to have you. We'll catch you Friday for Net Zero Carbon.
I love it. It's going to be a good one, 1 p.m. Tune in.